Hello, my name is Kelly Lemon. I'm a property investor and a property trainer. And one of the questions that I get asked all the time is, what's a yield? How do I work out the return on my investment? How do I know if it's a good deal? Actually, the question I get asked is, how do I know if it's a good deal? And part of the answer is that you need to understand what exactly you're looking at, and you need to be able to compare it from one property to another so you can actually make some sort of assessment. So what I'm going to do with you in this video is I'm going to share with you a training I gave where I went through three very specific calculations: the gross yield, the net yield, and return on investment. Now, they're all three different formulas and they're used in slightly different ways. And I'm going to share with you now a training that I gave specifically on those three formulas, how they work, and I'm going to put some numbers into them so you can really see how they're, you can see how it works and see how you would apply it. Because with all these videos, I really want to give you things that you can actually apply. I don't just want to give you the theory. I want to show you how you can actually implement it. And that really is kind of my role in some of these videos. Anyway, I'm going to pop back at the end of the very brief training I'm going to share with you with a few more tips and tricks. I'm always guided by the numbers when it comes to property. You cannot afford to get emotional about a buy-to-let property. And the question I'm often asked is, how do you measure property as an investment? Well, there are three main calculations to do this when you are initially assessing a property from a numbers perspective. And I'm going to run through all three right now for you. Now, the first one is gross yield. So the gross yield is a simple and quick way to work out your return on a property. You take the annual income, i.e. the rental income for the year, and then you divide that number by what you paid for it and then multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. So if we take our example from our previous module where we talked about leverage, let's stick with that example, let's stick with those numbers. Now, the annual rent would have been £8,400 and the purchase price was £100,000. So that gives us a gross yield of 8%. Now, this is useful information, but what it doesn't do with gross yield is it doesn't take into account any of the costs that you may have. So it's really only used as a quick and easy snapshot to see what the gross yield of a property is, just to compare them. But if you want to dig a bit deeper and dig into the detail so we know a bit more about this property and how it performs, then we need to look at the net yield. Now, the net yield takes your annual profit, so your rent minus any costs, and divides that number by the purchase price. And again, if we take the property from earlier that had a mortgage on it, it had a monthly mortgage of £375 a month. So even though the annual rent was £8,400, it had costs of £4,500, so its profit was a lot lower. And as you can see, the net yield is much lower at 3%. Now, to keep things simple, I've just taken the cost as the mortgage costs. But when you are looking at net yield, it's any costs that you incur when running the property. So that might be mortgage payments, insurance, bills, repairs, service charges, and all those sorts of things. I haven't included them in this example because I'm just trying to give you, again, a very conceptual, simplistic understanding of how these formulas work. But we do talk about them as the course goes on, and we do factor them into our spreadsheets. But like I say, so net yield is a lot more accurate than gross yield because it tells me a bit more, particularly if you're using a mortgage. But the calculation that I personally find most important is your return on investment. Now, the reason your return on investment, which a lot of people refer to as ROI, is so useful is because you're taking your annual profit, which is useful as that is what you end up with in your pocket, and you're dividing it by the amount of cash you have physically put into the property. So let's take that property. Now, the annual is lower as you have a mortgage to pay. We've already discussed that. However, your actual cash invested is also lower as you've used a mortgage. So your actual return on investment is higher, if that makes sense. So in essence, your return is lower, but your investment is lower, which means your return on investment is higher. And now this calculation is also referred to as return on cash, return on capital employed, as I say, ROI, and all those sorts of things. So I guess the next question is, well, which one should I use? Well, the truth is they all have a place. Now, I personally use return on investment as I want to know what my return what return my cash is getting. Now, I want to know if I put, say, 25k in a bank and get 2% interest, then I'm getting a 2% return on my money. Whereas if I put it into a property, and in our example, then I'm making a 15% return. So it helps me compare lemons with lemons in its simplistic form. Although it's worth noting that there will be other costs other than just the mortgage. So, like I say, these are broad strokes explaining how these work. However, there's a little bit more detail to go in. But going back to ROI, now the reason I really like and use ROI is because it tells me how long it will take for me to get my money back. Now what I mean by that is if my ROI is 10% on a property, then I know that in 10 years I would have repaid myself the initial investment through rental income. And then after that, in essence, anything else on top of that is just profit. And the reason I say that is because the 10%, if I'm getting a 10% return every year, then in 10 years I've got my 100% back. However, what I would say with all of these is they have their place. Now, net yield is really useful if you just want to compare one property to another. And it's also useful if you find a property and because you're only putting a small amount of money in, then you could look at it and see the ROI and take it at face value. However, it's good to see what kind of return the property would make without a mortgage. And the reason I say that is because you want to make sure that you're buying a property that you can also sell on. So the point that I'm making is you could actually look at your ROI and say, well, I'm not putting much money in and I'm getting a return, so that's a high percentage, and just take that at face value. But the reason I often use the other calculations is to say, well, that's fine, okay? But if somebody wasn't going to buy this with a mortgage, what would their gross yield be? Because if it's not an attractive investment without bank lending, then you might struggle to sell it. And that's a really big problem. So not only do you want to buy an investment that works for you, but you also want to buy an investment that you can sell on in the future and it's attractive to other people in other circumstances. Now, sometimes people can get a bit overwhelmed with numbers and formulas and all those sorts of things. So I know that I've sort of gone a bit in depth here. And again, you may need to sort of watch this a few times and it is in your workbook. But in essence, all I've done in this module is I've explained 3 ways, 3 formulas that you can use to calculate the return that your property is making. Gross yield, net yield, and your return investment. So all I really want you to do is kind of get your head around those 3 formulas, get your head around how you calculate them and practice, because one of the reasons it's so important to use these sorts of formulas is because you can compare 2 properties next to each other. Obviously, you can't compare gross yield on one property and net yield on another. You need to keep it consistent. But that's why I've given you 3 formulas so you can use the one that's most applicable, or you'll look at the number for all 3. So I hope you found that useful. I hope that's given you a bit more clarity, and I hope that gives you a few metrics that you can use when you're looking at property investments and deciding, as I said in the training, when you're comparing apples with apples. And it's really important. People get themselves in such a muddle by using net yield, gross yield, return investment. They intertwine them. They use the language without necessarily knowing the thought behind it. And I hope in that training you yourself got a bit more clarity in terms of how and why they're used. And along with this video, I've actually created a document that will help you kind of go through that in a little bit more detail. So you can click below and you can get that. I've got loads of resources on my website at www.kellylemon.com. I also release content weekly, so please come and join my email list. You're going to get tons of value from it. And I hope that you got value from this training, sharing it with you. And I hope that's given you a bit more clarity, because at the end of the day, the name of the game is once you get clear on what it is that you want and you can get clear on how you can get it, then it's more about the execution. And I hope today's video has given you that confidence and clarity when it comes to the numbers. Thanks for watching.